Good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Mark calling you from the Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook Recording Studio. And today we are talking about Book 1, Strategies for Quantitative Research. Remember, Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook gives you wings to fly far and high in your dissertation research. Book 1 is meant for doctoral learners working on quantitative dissertation projects, and you are encouraged to read this handbook the earliest possible in your dissertation process, preferably before you start formulating your statement of the problem. This book is supported by doctoral research seminars. To learn more, go to www.e/kdnc.org/e www.e.kdnc.org/e. Now, today we're going to speak about the independent or predictor variable, which is in chapter 6 of the manual. And so let us speak about the independent or predictor variable. When writing about the independent or predictor variable, and this is in the context of chapter 2 of your dissertation proposal, remind the reader your independent variable in the first sentence. If your design is experimental, use the term predictor variable if your design is quasi-experimental or non-experimental. Thus, your first sentence should read as follows: the independent or predictor variable in this study is ... And when you do that, straight away the reader is going to know what you're talking about. What is your independent variable? After this sentence, write a definition of the independent variable in one paragraph. Support your definition with citations from literature. Then explain to the reader that you will be discussing the independent or predictor variable from three perspectives: the history of the independent variable, the current reality, and the gap in literature. Those are the three perspectives. Consequently, you will divide the discussion into three subsections with three subtopics. Subtopic number 1 then is the history of the independent variable. The section number 2 will be subtopic number 2 is the current reality about independent variable, and subtopic number 3 is the gap in literature about the independent variable. Finally, write a conclusion about the independent variable. Okay, let's examine what you put in the subtopic history of the independent variable. Remember the rule of threes when discussing the history of the independent variable. In the first paragraph, explain how you will define the history. You can easily classify history in decades, periods, or epochs. One good way to classify history is by decades. You can frame your discussions around events happening by decades for events confined within 1 century. You can frame your discussion around events happening by centuries for events spanning multiple centuries within a millennium. For example, the history of the internet as an independent or predictor variable is amenable to classification by decades. A history of writing as an independent or predictor variable is amenable to classification by centuries. Consequently, the age of your independent variable will help you to determine the length of the timeline and your cutoff points, and hence your classification of your history. Avoid using historical classifications in lay literature such as baby boomers, baby boomer generation, generation X, and generation Y, unless your study involves any of these generations as the independent or predictor variable. After explaining the classification of your history, review all the literature that you can find about independent variable from the earliest date until 5 years ago. Discuss the literature from history in chronological order. Start with earliest events. Work your way towards the most recent events. Write as many subsections as necessary. Okay, you get that? Write as many subsections as necessary. Finally, write a transition statement in a separate paragraph explaining that you will be discussing the current reality in the next section. Alright, so what do we put under the current reality about the independent or predictor variable? Write an opening statement explaining that this section or this subsection contains all the events about the dependent or predictive variable happening within the last 5 years. Explore the most recent literature. Find out the recent findings about the independent variable. Explain the findings in 3 subsections. What are the findings? Why are they important in general? And what is the relevance of the findings to your dissertation project? A discussion about the relevance of the findings to your dissertation project will lead nicely to a discussion about the gap in literature about independent variable. Gap in literature about independent or predictor variable. When reviewing literature about independent or predictor variable, you will come across puzzling questions, many of which remain unanswered. The place to find unanswered questions is the recommendations section of peer-reviewed articles. The standard practice for all peer-reviewed articles is a section dedicated to recommendations for future research. You'll find this section at the end of the discussion of peer-reviewed article. Authors use this section to explain the issues they could not explain in the research. Authors give different kinds of reasons for recommendations for further research. For example, they could have stumbled upon new information that did not fit the analysis model. Consequently, they could not use their model to explain the information. In such a case, they can suggest further investigation using a different kind of model. The more recent the article, the more likely the recommendations remain unexplored. This is one of the major reasons for requirement of the 85% rule for literature review of less than 5 years. Researchers most likely address the recommendations from older literature in any case, so in the newer literature. So don't go looking for gaps in literature in very old literature. Another point to remember is that you cannot answer all unanswered questions. When reviewing recommendations from articles in recent literature, always ask, how does this recommendation tie in with my research question? Recommendations that do not tie with your research question can be a serious distraction for you. Leave them alone. Someone else will take care of them. Recommendations that tie in with what you're doing, take only those recommendations that tie in with what you're doing. Let other people take the rest. A good way to structure the gap in literature section is to make a list of relevant recommendations about independent variable in the recent literature. From that list, select recommendations that you think are most relevant to the research question. Draw a matrix of analysis of selected recommendations as shown on Table 5 in Chapter 6 of Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook. Explain why you think each of the recommendation is relevant in a separate paragraph. When you are done with the analysis of the recommendations, write a new paragraph explaining that you will write about the summary and a conclusion of the independent and predictor variable. So, conclusion about the independent and predictor variable. The conclusion of the independent or predictor variable is, in a sense, a summary of the discussions about the independent or predictor variable. In this section, summarize the discussion about the history in one paragraph, summarize the discussion about current literature in another paragraph, and finally summarize the discussion about recommendations or gap in literature in a third paragraph. Then write a conclusion of this section and close the section by stating that you will turn your attention to the dependent or outcome variable in the section that follows. Again, friends, this is Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook talking about how to develop an independent variable. Remember, Dr. Mark Dissertation Mentoring Handbook gives you wings to fly far and high in your dissertation research. Book 1 is meant for doctoral learners working on quantitative dissertation projects. You are encouraged to read this handbook the earliest possible in your dissertation process, preferably before you start formulating your statement of the problem. This book is supported by doctoral research seminars. To learn more, go to www.e.kdmc.org/e. Thank you.